Alright, so in this presentation I'm going to be speaking about the visitor design pattern. Throughout this presentation we're going to go through what is the visitor design pattern, some of the pros and cons of it, and then a UML diagram of how it's generally implemented, and then a code implementation of the visitor design pattern. So first things first, what is it? The visitor design pattern allows for the separation of existing objects from the addition of new functionality to those objects. So in simpler terms, it allows for us to update the functionality of existing objects without modifying the object itself. We would update the functionality of this object through what is called the visitor object or the visitor interface. This visitor interface would include all of the additional methods or functionality that we would implement into these objects, and these objects would call the visitor interface to allow us to implement those new methods. So the visitor pattern is broken down into 6 main parts. The first part being the visitable interface. This interface is what's implemented in any concrete visitable interface which would interact with a visitor object. These concrete visitable interfaces are typically just POJOs or simple objects. So the visitor interface is what is implemented by a concrete visitor, which is used to update the functionality of the concrete visitable objects. The visitable objects typically use an accept method, which is what accepts a visitor object and allows for the visitor object to make changes to the visitable object without actually modifying that initial object. And then lastly, the visit method is a method in the visitor, which is what would actually contain the updated functionality. So here is a simple UML breakdown of the visitor pattern. You have your concrete visitor, which extends the visitor interface, and you have your concrete visitable, which extends your visitable interface, and then you have your client. Typically, you would have multiple concrete visitable objects that would be used by the client and could be used by one or more visitors. But typically there's multiple visitables to one visitor. Nextly, we'll move into like the code example of the visitor design pattern, which kind of is a code / UML diagram. Here we use an example of tax collector, or a tax calculator, sorry, not tax collector, tax calculator, which calculates the tax of certain items that would be sold in a store. In this case, we use 2 different items, tobacco and food, because the tax is typically different on the 2 of them. Here is an implementation of the visitable interface, which is implemented in the food and tobacco objects. In each object, there's a price. There's the constructor, which sets the price. There is the accept method, which we talked about earlier, which would then call the visitor, which would be passed to the accept method. And then there's a get price, so we can return the price of each object. Next, we have the visitor object, which extends the interface visitor. In this case, our concrete visitor is called tax visitor, which implements visitor. In tax visitor, to make it simple, what we did was we included a Java library called decimal format, which just allows for us to return double numbers with 2 decimal places. We have an empty constructor because in this example we didn't need it, but you could use this for other examples if you needed to. In our concrete visitor, we have our visit function, which is implemented and overridden from the interface. In this case, it just says what type of tax we're talking about, or what the price of the item is with tax, and then it displays the actual price with tax. So in this case, if it's a food item, we multiply the value of the item times 1.06 for 6% tax and display that. For tobacco, we say that a tobacco item has the tax of 12%, so we return the price times 1.12 and display that. And then finally, we have the actual execution of the code, which we have our main function, or our main class, which calls the tax visitor, which we call visitor. We have our food. In this case, we're going to use a specific example of bacon, which we say costs $1.99, whether or not it actually does. And then we have our tobacco, which will be our cigarettes, which costs, in this case, $6.99. So what ends up happening is we go to the system out print line. We have bacon, which calls that accept function, which we pass our tax visitor to. and then it'll take the visitor class visit and apply the food bacon, which is $1.99, to that visit function and return the price of $2.11, which would be the $1.99 times 6% sales tax. And then we also do the same thing for cigarettes, which would be the $6.99 times the 12% sales tax, which returns $7.83. So that's a general breakdown and an example of the visitor pattern, kind of down and dirty real quick of what it does and how it works. But in summary, the visitor pattern allows for quick implementation of additional features to existing objects without actually modifying the object itself. So it allows for us to make changes without potentially breaking how objects work in potentially large code bases.